Welcome to our third video in this module of biopsychology. In this video, you're going to be learning about the different parts of the nervous system. We'll first start by looking at the peripheral nervous system. Typically, when we think about the nervous system, we think about the central nervous system, which is comprised of the brain and spinal cord. But we're going to start with the peripheral nervous system and then move on to the central nervous system. And I think you'll see that this makes sense as we move in then to the next video to particular parts of the brain. So as we look at the peripheral nervous system, we'll look at its divisions, and we'll also look at something called the fight or flight response. We'll also be looking at homeostasis. And then, as I said, we'll be looking at a basic overview of the brain and spinal cord. If we look at the overall nervous system, it's comprised of two major divisions. The first major division is the central nervous system, and that would include the brain and spinal cord. And then the other major division is the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system has two major divisions. The first being the somatic nervous system, and the second being the autonomic nervous system. So when we think about peripheral, we can think about the word periphery. So it's everything outside of the center of this, everything outside of the central nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is important for sensing and responding. And the actions that the somatic nervous system takes require voluntary conscious action. So for example, you might be walking on the beach and you step on a rock and it hurts your foot. And so you feel that, you sense it, and then you lift your foot up to check it to see if you're injured. You might move your foot away because it hurt, and so you're responding. And so we have sensory and motor neurons that are involved in this response. And then we have what is called the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is very important for automatic, involuntary responses. And thank goodness it's involuntary because there's quite a bit going on within the autonomic nervous system. The first thing that you'll see that's happening is we have what's called the sympathetic nervous system. The easiest way to remember this and what its function is when you look at sympathetic, you may think of a person who is sympathetic or sympathizing with someone. And the sympathetic nervous system is almost, I guess you could say, sympathizing with you during times of stress. It's trying to help you. It's preparing you to fight or to flee. So some of you may have heard the phrase fight or flight, and that's what the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for, that fight or flight response. So the fight or flight response, and we'll be looking at this in a little bit more depth here in a moment, but it's responsible for things like dilating your pupils, which allows more light in, slowing down digestion so you can use the energy that you need to fight or to flee for things other than digestion. It's also important for increasing your breathing rate, increasing your heart rate, and many other things that we'll be looking at. And so imagine if you were to stay in this constant state of sympathetic nervous system arousal. That would be a tremendous amount of stress on your body. Now, I will say that if we look at human history, the sympathetic nervous system, it has been very adaptive. It's very important. If we look at our ancestors who lived in pretty rugged, difficult conditions and needed to be able to very quickly respond to a particular threat, it made sense for them then to have this sympathetic nervous system response. But today's modern problems and stressors don't necessarily always require the dilation of pupils, increase in heart rate, increase in breathing rate, slowing down of digestion, etc. So in today's society, we do have lots of different what we might call acute or short-term stressors. We have frustrations. You know, you're driving to school and you find that someone's driving very slow in front of you or someone cuts you off. You go to class, you realize you had a test and you forgot. Maybe you go to work and you have a customer who's unkind to you, maybe is very rude. And each of these may cause a sympathetic nervous system response, but it's not something that that sympathetic nervous system response is not really going to help you in those particular times. So our body is responding in the way that was very adaptive and helpful for our ancestors. Now, are there times when you would be needing that type of sympathetic nervous system response? Yes, absolutely. When you really are legitimately threatened. But think about today's chronic stressors, acute stressors. Think about those that activate that sympathetic nervous system response and the effect that that can have on your body. Think about the slowing down of digestion and just that alone, how that could affect how you feel. So if you're regularly exposed to stressors that cause your body to respond in that way, you could understand why you might have feelings of nausea, why you might have other stomach troubles as well. So thankfully, we have what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, and it is important for what's called homeostasis. And homeostasis is a very important term, and that is a state of balance or a balanced state of functioning. And we might see this term in other contexts in this course, but in this chapter, we want to think of it in terms of that physical balanced state of functioning. So it really brings us back to normal. If you look at this image here, you'll see that the sympathetic nervous system does many different things to prepare you to fight or to flee. Sometimes you might even hear this as the fight, flight, or freeze response. And some of you may have had this type of response when you've had to give a public speech. And if you think about it, it sort of makes sense why this happens. If you go back to your ancestors, if you were, alone in the woods, everything seems okay, and then you look in front of you and you see a large group of people just staring at you. Historically, for our ancestors, this would have been a threat. And so when you're up in front of your classmates and they're all staring at you, your body is responding in the way that made sense for your ancestors. And so for your ancestors, they would have had that increase in heart rate, perhaps the dilation of pupils. You would find too the slowing down of digestion and many of these other things that are happening. And then what happens too when we have a sympathetic nervous system response is we're really in this automatic pilot mode. And so we're not relying on higher level thinking processes. And that's why sometimes when we are stressed, when we're in this fight or flight mode, it can be difficult to think reasonably and rationally, more difficult to control our emotions. So if you're in a disagreement with someone and you feel that happening to your body, you know it's going to be more difficult for you to control what you say. You might be more prone to saying things that you don't want to. So when you start to feel yourself getting in this state, you know it's probably the best thing for you to do is if it really is not a legitimate threat and other people are around who you might say things to that you don't mean, it might be best to walk away for a moment until you can get back to that balanced state of functioning. And then we see that parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for homeostasis. And we can also think of this as rest and digest. So as we talked about, we have the central nervous system, which is one division of the overall nervous system. So the nervous system can be divided into the central and peripheral nervous systems. The central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. So some of the spinal cord functions include transmitting neural signals between the brain and the rest of the body, also independently controlling many different reflexes. And then it's the main pathway for information that connects the brain and the peripheral nervous system. And if you'll remember, the peripheral nervous system is that division that we just talked about that is comprised of the somatic nervous system and also the autonomic nervous system. So what have you learned so far? Well, we very briefly touched on the theory of evolution. And many of you know that the premise behind this is that those behaviors, those traits that are going to promote survival and reproduction, those are the ones that are going to be passed on from one generation to the next. And evolutionary psychologists are interested in understanding behavior through that lens. So if you're not familiar with that, I would encourage you to make sure that you go back in your textbook and take a look at that section. We also talked about genetic variation. You learned about the difference between genotype and phenotype. We also did an actual Punnett square as we talked about the likelihood of a child having a particular trait. We also looked at polygenic traits, and we talked about how many traits that we have are a result of a combination of alleles, not just one single allele. And then we talked about epigenetics. So you learned about that. You learned about the relationship between the environment and genes, and that not only can our genes be affected by the environment that we live in, and it immediately or long term may affect us, but we may pass the effects of the environment on our genes onto our offspring, who then pass that on to theirs. So you may have a grandparent who then, because of their environment and the changes in their genes, may have a grandchild that experiences the effect of that environment. And then I gave you an example of environment and genetic vulnerability as we looked at schizophrenia. So we know that nature and nurture are not working in isolation. We know it's not an either or proposition. We know that they interact with one another. As we look at human behavior, you're going to be exploring many different behaviors and traits. And throughout this semester, you'll be hearing more about the role of genetics in influencing who we are. What we're going to be taking a look at now is we're going to be taking a look at the nervous system. And so I'm going to be giving you some basics about the neuron.